Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Brad. Suzanne is right. I have a number of former bosses in the room. I'm looking at you, Sue, Andrew. So we're hoping to get some questions from you. We've talked a lot over the past few days in sort of like loftier terms about public-private partnerships. And our goal with this panel is to take a little bit more of a pragmatic approach and hear directly from practitioners sort of what some of the structural changes have looked like, especially in the last year or so in terms of information sharing. So Suzanne and Brad, thank you again. I think I've been to almost every conference, maybe missed one. And we can't think of a better forum where we have the right private sector partners already in the room, already with the buy-in, as we just heard from feedback, looking to remove obstacles to sharing. And so that's why we wanted to tee this up today. So with that, I'd like to just kind of go down the line and do a quick intro, and then we'll get to the meat of it.
Well, good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. And thanks also to Suzanne and Brad for organizing a wonderful conference. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm Dana Madsen. I'm the Deputy Director of ODNI's Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. We were founded almost a decade ago based on lessons learned from the North Korean cyber attack on Sony Motion Pictures. And we've evolved today to think about integrating IC intelligence in support of national security and policy making, support to the policy process, and also IC strategy and investments. And our newest office, thinking about strategic cyber partnerships, in particular with the private sector, but also with our allies.
Great, thank you. Shannon.
Shannon Corless with the Department of the Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. As I mentioned yesterday, OIA was formed as a result of 9/11 and a need to understand how terrorists were raising, storing, moving funds to facilitate their malign activities around the world. I also mentioned how we cover the waterfront of a wide range of issues, but relevant to this conversation, our focus on cyber is actually one of our newest areas of emphasis for OIA. We formally stood up a new directorate probably about 3 years ago or so, and that was actually out of a recognition that we needed to do more to support the financial sector. So it's been interesting to see our work on this evolve over time, and working with the financial sector has always been sort of a part of the conversation internally. So look forward to having the rest of this conversation.
Thank you. And Kristina.
So I'm Kristina Walter. I am the director of NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. So we stood up our collaboration center about 4 years ago. And that was really because we, at NSA, have two real big missions. The first is we are an intelligence agency. We're trying to inform policymakers to make good choices based off what we know from foreign intelligence, but also a combat support agency. And so we had years of intelligence that said, you know, we're targeting the defense industrial base, adversaries are, and they're looking to steal intellectual property to further their military gains. And we needed to action that information directly with our partners. We needed to inform them because we want our critical warfighters to be protected. The defense industrial base is a key partner in that. So we stood at the Collaboration Center really with the thought that if we could get together and we could take that foreign intelligence perspective about what we see nation-state actors doing, and we can get together with the cloud providers, the internet service providers, the defense industrial base companies, and understand what they see on their networks, since they're the ones being targeted day in and day out, we could really understand this activity faster, more comprehensively, and we can tailor mitigation guidance out that really is beneficial to the entire community. So that's really what our goal is.
Thank you. So throughout the conference, we've heard from Admiral Whitworth with his conversation with Sue, and then also General Hawk last night about increased partnerships with the private sector. It's almost like we're all on the same sheet of music, which is actually all coming from the XCOM, which is the body that the DNI chairs with the various directors of IC agencies who have all agreed. There's a whole plan that we have on our website, dni.gov, we can share with everybody on how we're going to make structural changes in the coming year to change the way that we collaborate with the private sector and make it more sort of permanent and incentivized, and removing some of the barriers. So I think we'll also hear from Director Burns a bit tonight on some of the work CIA is doing specifically in the tech space with that. So with that, that's sort of like the context and the backdrop. We wanted to start with the threat landscape and sort of from each panelist perspective, why working with the private sector is more important now than ever through the specific threat landscape. So first to Dana.
I'd like to make a general point. One is that from a threat standpoint, over the past 5 years or so, we've seen an inflection in the threat landscape where 5 to 10 years ago, we were talking very much about cyber espionage, the theft of intellectual property. But now, and as you've seen in the various presentations today and yesterday, cyber attack is also an issue that we're concerned with that really drives that collaboration with the private sector that is often on the front lines of that threat, particularly our critical infrastructure owners and operators. And we see two manifestations of that threat. One is the very sophisticated activity conducted by the PRC-sponsored Volt Typhoon actors. But we've also seen less sophisticated actors that have also caused cyber-physical effects. And it's another aspect of the threat environment that drives that collaboration with the private sector. I'll also flag one other dynamic that's important, which is from the policy context. Earlier this year, the White House issued National Security Memorandum 22 on critical infrastructure resilience. It's the update nearly a decade later of PPD 21. And one of the key drivers in that document is intelligence sharing through the SRMAs, the sector risk management agencies, and law enforcement with the private sector and bidirectional information exchange driven by this threat landscape.
Thank you, Dana. Over to you, Shannon.
So when we first started looking at this issue about 3-4 years ago or so and really formalized our approach to supporting the financial sector, we were mostly looking at issues such as hacktivists, ransomware, criminal actors, but we have seen an evolution in the concerns with respect to the financial sector. Now we're looking at state actors. So as we discussed yesterday, we're very concerned about the actions that China might take to hold our financial sector's interests at risk in the event of a China-Taiwan conflict. We're very concerned about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and what that means for any of our sectors who have a presence overseas. And certainly we're also very concerned still about the opportunistic nature of Iran's cyber actors as well.
I would say from our perspective, so we obviously track the big four cyber threats. So the PRC is the enduring threat that we are trying to counter. We recognize that they are very familiar with the way with which we operate in the United States, the way with which we share contracting information. We are very public about who is building what capabilities for the United States government, and they leverage that to their advantage. We find they're taking advantage of the weakest link in supply chains as much as they can. They're going after the basic cyber hygiene that is not as pervasive as it should be across our industrial base. So we see both China and Russia taking advantage of unpatched systems, looking for misconfigurations, doing brute force password spraying attacks to get into the networks and then move laterally. The campaigns are very sophisticated. Obviously, that is where the partnership with industry has been critical. We only see one piece from our foreign intelligence aperture. We understand perhaps what they intend to do, maybe what they're doing in a foreign space, but we don't have that insight for the domestic space. So when we're trying to put that puzzle piece together of the threat, that's why we've partnered with industry, because it's so critical, because we have intelligence that we're bringing to the fight, but industry has equal intelligence in most cases about what they're seeing actually happening on their network, and it's when we bring those together that we're also able to operationalize it. I'll say the two other things that we are tracking is obviously the ransomware and the cyber criminal market and how profitable that is. While the large companies have good cyber hygiene, we see the small businesses, the more vulnerable critical infrastructure entities being vulnerable to that type of attack. And the industry is so profitable that it's getting more sophisticated, as well as the impact of artificial intelligence coming into that attack cycle. So generally, you used to be able to identify a phishing email. You could tell if something was off. With the use of generative AI, all of that is getting more sophisticated. So while it helps us write keynote speeches and addresses for groups like this, it's also helping to make our adversaries more realistic looking in when they're trying to target the average person who could be susceptible to that.
So we'd like to try to get as more specific as possible. So with that, the question is, what is some sort of national security win or gain that you have been privy to that would not have occurred had it not been for such collaboration with the private sector?
Yeah, do you want me to
I can start. Yeah.
So I think we've talked a lot about Volt Typhoon, but I want to take it back a little bit earlier to 2022, where we at NSA understood that the PRC specifically leverages what we call obfuscation networks. So they target small office routers, they target small businesses, they target vulnerable populations, and then they move up the supply chain based off trusted relationships. And so we know that they work in these big obfuscation networks. And we were working with some of our partners to really understand that activity, really enumerate what is a PRC-owned device that's targeting and what is not. And through that collaboration, we identified a connection from a known PRC infrastructure to one of our defense contractors. And so within hours of this routine analytic collaboration finding this activity, we tipped this to our defense industrial base partner. It was a Citrix ADC environment that was being targeted. The partner came back, they did full remediation, they had fixed the environment, they came back 2 weeks later and said, we see the actor there again. So we recognized that this was likely a previously unknown vulnerability. So this really took a whole of industry, whole of government approach where we brought them in. The patch was worked for that particular vulnerability, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure people could detect the activity, they could see it, they could understand it, so that they wouldn't just patch, but have already been compromised and not know. So we collectively, with our partners, took all of the insights that we had and put out a public cybersecurity advisory, really in an unprecedented timeline in about 2 weeks, so that when the patch, Citrix released their patch, we could also release a complementary detection guide so that you could see if the activity had happened on your network. Recognizing that this was really the start of us understanding the sophistication of the PRC activity, their ability to clean log data, to go back and retroactively make it really tough to discover. So we released those jointly with the vendor when they released their patch and actually saw unpatched systems drop 25% within a couple days. So this is where we recognize that when we as a government can take an authoritative voice and industry can work on their end, collectively the outcome can be greater than either one of us individually. So that collaboration has really evolved into what came out last year in May of 23 with the Volt Typhoon Cybersecurity Advisory. So understanding plans and intentions, but working with industry partner to actually find that Volt Typhoon is in fact embedded in critical infrastructure and they are in fact pre-positioning, and how can we detect it? So you heard General Hawk talk last night about exposure is the start of collaboration. We are at a point now where we have been able to detect the activity, where industry partners can detect the activity, where we have small municipalities coming and calling CISA or NSA or FBI and saying, I see this activity that's consistent with Volt Typhoon. That entire campaign would not have been possible without the sharing of insights between the National Security Agency, our interagency partners, and our industry partners.
That's great. Shannon?
Yeah, sure. And similarly, we had an instance speaking specifically to Volt Typhoon where we had briefed this to our cleared sector audience, and one of the members in the financial sector came back to us and said, after briefing, they went back and took a look at their networks and they saw indicators of activity related to Volt Typhoon, and they were very grateful because it allowed them to start taking the necessary steps they needed to remediate the matter on their networks. It's also a really great example of how that feedback is so important to us, because once we know that this is something that is of concern to our sector partners, it allows us to better tailor the way that we are engaging them and making sure that we are providing them with the right kind of information that they need. I would also offer, too, that from a bidirectional sharing information, that we had a win from the standpoint of we were starting to develop that trust, such that the financial sector is willing to come to us on their own initiative, share information with us about concerning activity on their networks. And in this one particular instance, we found it so salient, and it was concerning. It was concerning what a sector firm saw in terms of state actor activity on a foreign country's network. And it was so relevant to what we were watching that it ended up feeding into analysis that we published up to the highest levels of government.
Dana.
Our example at ODNI is a little bit different because ODNI's unique take is we convene, we integrate the IC. And so we had a case where we brought together a cross-section of the interagency, the intelligence community, and the private sector to think about a particular new aspect of the threat environment. I mentioned earlier the trend toward cyber attack and some of the less sophisticated actors. Since late last year, we've seen a group called the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, or CAR. It's a pro-Russia group using very unsophisticated techniques to cause physical effects on water sector and agriculture sector targets in the United States and in Western Europe. And so we began to understand that there's a need to think about how do we provide intelligence support to the water sector. So we convened something called an industry analytic partnership. And what we did is brought together owners and operators, both in large cities and rural areas, equipment manufacturers, systems integrators, associations, the interagency. We worked with CISA to co-sponsor this. And what we did is talk through together some of the dynamics of what's going on in the water sector. We did one-time read-ins so that we could share with our industry partners the threat context that we're seeing from a classified standpoint. We had our partners talk about what was possible in terms of some of the security vulnerabilities in the water sector. And we also, just as importantly, had a conversation about business dynamics in the sector, how the sector has to balance municipal budgets with regulatory imperatives, with the imperative of water being affordable, with new requirements such as dealing with forever chemicals, the PFAS, to understand how they think about resource allocation. And so it was one of these cases where we could bring together the sector so that we could help the IC and IC analysts better tailor their analysis to the needs of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the Sector Risk Management Agency, and the broader sector, including its sophistication, its ability to receive intelligence. And I think that this is a dynamic that we're going to see play out in the coming years, particularly with the advent of National Security Memorandum 22. We're going to see that there are different sectors that have different abilities to understand, receive, and act on intelligence, and different business dynamics, whether it's water, agriculture, the financial sector, which is a very sophisticated consumer of intelligence. And in each case, there's an important aspect of tailoring the analysis, but also understanding what is systemically important in that entity. And so that is something that we've thought about uniquely from the OD&I standpoint, is that convening, that integrating, to have these very frank conversations that make our analysis across the IC better.
Wasn't there something, too, where, without getting into, I know, too many details, where some partners maybe hadn't even spoken to each other, or they sort of changed their perspective based off the exchange, and now have relationships moving forward?
Absolutely. And in fact, these relationships from this water sector event that we did in May, they've actually carried forward. And just a couple of weeks ago, we did the same type of dynamic to look at scaled cyber events where a critical infrastructure vulnerability might cut across different sectors, say water, power, and maybe the chemical sector. And so what we're trying to do is gradually build these interactions, build these trust relationships, so that as the cyber landscape evolves, these relationships are in place where we can bring people together and have these frank conversations. And you're right, there are several entities that hadn't talked to each other, and so it was that ability to introduce industry to themselves. And for a variety of reasons in different sectors, that dynamic occurs, whether it's just they haven't thought to talk to each other, or sometimes it's just thinking about some of the competitive considerations that drive the sector.
Let's get into some of the structural changes that have been manifesting in the last year or so and then moving forward. So there's writing for release, sort of tailoring analysis to share with different partners. Some of our offices have actually established sort of public-facing offices. So kind of going down the line, maybe starting with Kristina, just walk us through some of the changes that have occurred and sort of what's new and different about it.
Yeah, so we had this bit of a debate while we were talking about this panel of, there's a couple options when you're trying to operationalize information to industry. One is you clear them all, as many as you can, and you give them classified information. And the other is you declassify as much as you can and you get the information out. I would say from our perspective, some of the cultural changes that we've done is we recognized really early on that if the information wasn't unclassified and we couldn't get it in the hands of the net defenders who can actually action it, it wasn't that useful. It's helpful to give the C-suite contextual conversations as to what the threat is so that they can support the resources and support their teams to work on these efforts. But realistically, in order for the information to be actioned, we have to get it to an unclassified level. So you heard General Hawk talk last night about 70 cybersecurity advisories that we have put out. That's publicly. That's so that anybody can go to NSA.gov and see it. The other thing that we've done is we have 10,000 analytic exchanges that are happening over every quarter over the last 2 years since we stood up the Collaboration Center. So that is NSA analysts who really understand China and Russia or other nation-state actors in collaboration channels with industry net defenders. So not the C-suite executives, not the leadership team, but truly the analysts so that they can talk day to day about what they are seeing to help understand it. So we're really trying to get to a place where we are equipping those folks who are doing the active defense on the network, who are overtaxed, under-resourced, and having a swath of threats coming at them. Our goal is to make sure we're giving them as much context as possible. And so we want to take what we know from an intelligence aperture, and we want to downgrade it so that we can tell them this is really specific. This is Russian wiper malware that we think that they're going to deploy globally. This is Chinese obfuscation networks where we see them connecting to your system or systems in your sector. And give them that really specific actionable information, and then to Shannon's point, get feedback from them so that we can really help to understand it. That for NSA has been a huge culture change. Getting our analysts in a channel or in a meeting with industry partners has not been a small feat. Helping them understand that to know something is great. To action that knowledge is better. And so we need to make sure that we're constantly thinking of, when we understand a campaign or we're starting to understand activity, what value industry brings so that we can fully understand it, and then who is best able to action it, whether that's an industry partner, an interagency partner, or one of our foreign partners. That's really the mindset shift that we're trying to implement.
Thanks. Shannon, walk us through the T-Suite.
Certainly. So I'll take a step back. There's actually a larger initiative that the Department of the Treasury started about 6 months ago or so called Project Fortress. So there are two arms within Treasury that engage the financial sector in support of the cyber resiliency of their networks. There's the Office of, the Office of Critical Infrastructure Protection, which is the policy arm of the department. And they're, as you would imagine, they are the ones who set policy, and they're also the ones who do incident response for the department. Within the past 6 months or so, they announced a program called Project Fortress, which is essentially a proactive way of engaging the financial sector to ensure that they are benefiting from all of the U.S. government capabilities and private sector capabilities and data that they possibly can as they take actions on their network. Another part of Project Fortress is our own new initiative, which is the Treasury Cyber Collaboration Suite, which we fondly call the T-Suite, a little bit of a play on C-Suite. Mm-hmm. And that is our own collaboration center. And it's a really exciting development. We opened the doors at a downtown facility in D.C. about 6 months ago or so. And we are able to bring in cleared members of the financial sector to sit side by side with us. And we're able to proactively share information with them on a weekly, if not daily basis, depending on the nature of the issue that we're dealing with. We share information on a tactical basis with them. We also have very strategic conversations about what are some of the big trends that we see on the horizon. It got me thinking about General Hoff's remarks last night, and I can't remember what the specific question was, but his answer was something along the lines of a big desire would be to have a campaign, right? And I think what we're starting to see here with the T-Suite is maybe the very beginnings of that campaign that he envisions, where we're collaborating together toward a solution in defense of our networks. So we're able to bring these folks in and have that conversation. We also have a lot of folks who are in the sector who are uncleared. And to Kristina's point, we don't necessarily need to get the entirety of the financial sector cleared. What we need to do is find the right people to have those high-level classified conversations with, and then migrate to the room next door where we bring in uncleared members of the sector, and we actually talk about the infrastructure. And that's been a big development, and we've made a lot of progress, I think, in a very short time. I also think another thing that we've done that's been very helpful is we've started having conversations when appropriate with certain financial sector executives. And I think that's really important because, as any leader of an organization knows, your folks will do what you ask them to do. And so this allows us to share with them the context that we are seeing, and it gives them the ability to provide top cover for certain parts of their organization who need to take these actions. So that is something that we hope to do more of because it has just been so powerful in the short bit of time that we've done it.
Thank you. Dana.
I'll share two things we're doing now, and then one area that is an opportunity we see that we're in the process of scoping out. Right now, we have been using commercial cyber threat intelligence. We have contractual relationships with multiple vendors, and we've used those relationships to apply all-source analysis techniques to take that information and derive strategic insights about the threat landscape that can serve a variety of purposes. Most recently, last Monday, we published an unclassified product on our open website looking at trends in the ransomware threat, basically taking data from multiple vendors, applying some machine learning and some data conditioning to bring the data together to basically answer the question that is one of the hardest questions in the ransomware landscape, which is how many attacks are occurring, and is the threat getting better or worse? And so we did this in support of the White House's counter-ransomware initiative last week, and we looked at trends geographically across the different continents, and we also, within each continent, broke it down by ransomware's impact on sector. And the goal was to show to this broader international audience of 68 nations that ransomware is not just a U.S. problem, not just a U.S. and Western Europe problem, but also a global problem that could benefit from the exchange of ideas and lessons learned. And so we've done that for several years, again, drawing on the commercial cyber threat intelligence. We've also thought about and accomplished other areas applying that same tactic of working our relationships with the commercial cyber threat intelligence vendors to produce at a very broad, unclassified level. I'll give you two examples. The cyber physical attacks that I mentioned earlier on the water sector, we published a piece that highlighted that. We used that at our water industry analytic partnership that I mentioned earlier. We shared that broadly at the unclassified level, but we actually had a classified version of that chart that we shared at the conference. And it profiled over the past, since late 2023, attacks that have been conducted by IRGC, linked actors using the moniker Cyber Avengers, who have used default configuration mistakes and default passwords in programmable logic controllers produced by an Israeli firm to cause disruptions or deface the control interfaces of these systems across the water sector, agriculture sector, and targets worldwide. That same piece that I'm talking about that's on our website also profiles some of the activity by Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, both in rural areas targeting the water sector, but also in other areas of the United States where they've targeted the energy sector and the food and agriculture sector. And then finally, we've thought about how do we use the analytic insights that we provide to educate the private sector. One of the challenges out there is North Korean cyber actors who are basically working to generate revenue for their government. And there are North Korean IT workers that will basically gain virtual employment under false auspices. They will adapt seemingly U.S. identities. They will have people that facilitate the backstopping of that identity. And the proceeds that they earn from their IT work get sent back to North Korea to help with revenue generation and sanctions evasion. We actually published an unclassified product that also supported FBI in identifying some of the key indicators for a company that they may be targeted by a North Korean cyber actor seeking employment under these auspices. So I think there's definitely a market for this unclassified analysis. It's also important as we think about this because across the critical infrastructure sectors, there are some sectors that are just not geared to receive classified analysis. And so we need to think about how to do the analysis at this level for them. We also do regular analysis at the top secret level on a weekly basis in support of the Cyber Response Group. This is a White House convened meeting weekly. It's basically the longest running IPC or Interagency Policy Committee. And it brings together the White House, law enforcement, the cyber defense agencies, the sector risk management agencies. And we think about and provide the intelligence context working across the IC with our colleagues to tee up what are some of the key threat concerns for this week and what are some of the analytic insights on them. And that starts a conversation then about what does that mean for our response to different incidents? What are we seeing about ongoing incidents? So these happen at the top secret and the unclassified levels. One gap that we see and one potential opportunity is how do we more directly work with the IC to tailor our intelligence to the state and local level and to the critical infrastructure operators out in the field that may be cleared to the secret level, that may be able to have a productive conversation. And so we're thinking about how, by analogy to what we do with the CRG every week, the Cyber Response Group at the top secret level, how do we think about a periodic briefing that highlights some of the key threat concerns that they should be keyed to or concerned about at the secret level. And I think generally there's opportunity as we think about it, writing for release to engage at all levels of classification just for varying purposes to drive collective action on the threat.
A couple quick thoughts. One is this writing for release notion. We've talked about how there were all these lessons in post 9/11 CT world where, and still today, as Brett mentioned yesterday, where NCTC produces products for state and locals. And so we're trying to incorporate some of those best practices across the different threat sectors, including cyber. And then would you also, isn't there sort of a visual with the water problem? Like, weren't there tanks overflowing in a U.S. state? Like, could you kind of paint the picture a little bit?
Yeah.
It actually happened. It wasn't like, in theory, they got in beyond a password. Like, there was a physical effect.
Let me walk you through a day in the life of the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. Basically, they have a playbook, and so they scan the internet, and they're looking for default passwords, unpatched software, misconfigurations, and they're looking for it in a particular type of software. It's called VNC. It's basically something that allows you to have a remote view into a human user interface. And this software, the water sector uses this to have remote access to programmable logic controllers that control the water flow in and out of tanks. So what these actors do is they scan broad swaths of the internet, find these vulnerable systems, take advantage of these vulnerabilities, and then they just randomly start manipulating the interface. And sometimes nothing happens, sometimes something does happen, and we've had several instances where it's water or wastewater where they have caused tanks to overflow or wastewater to be spilled. Now you can imagine that there is a public health and safety aspect to this if they're doing this, where we've been fortunate that they haven't caused that yet. but you can imagine that prospect. And so one of the key things and one of the key messages for this type of threat actor that we've tried to convey to the water sector is you may be a target, and it's not the fact that they are targeting you explicitly, it's just because of the fact that you're connected to the internet. And that's a mindset shift, particularly if you're in one of the more rural locations. You've got a lot of things on your plate. You're trying to keep the physical system running, you're trying to keep the IT running, and you've got a variety of other pressures on your plate. And you may not think you're a target, so you think it's okay to take these shortcuts. And so one of the messages that we've tried to convey from this particular incident is to say you actually might be a target, and it's just by virtue, it's not that they're targeting you explicitly, it's just by virtue of being connected to the internet. And I think our concern is that the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, that's the first instance that we've seen about in this area. The concern is we could see more actors adopting similar tactics in the future.
Thanks, Dana. So we'd really like to have some questions and discussion with the time we have left. Also, you may notice my email address is up on the slide because we would love feedback and thoughts on this topic in general and how we can be better with the private sector. So Suzanne, do we have any questions?
Let's see. I warned everybody. I told them to get
I see a hand.
Okay.
I see a hand in the golf shirt.
We got several here. Okay.
Hi, thank you for your work and thanks for your collaboration. I'm Adam Mariyama. I'm from Garrison, now a part of EverFox. And I'm thinking about partnership outside or I guess beyond the intel space, right? There's a threat that the intelligence community knows better than anyone from a strategic level. How can we as industry, as the people who supply products and services to the critical infrastructure sector, partner best with you and with industry as real design partners to design the solutions that go beyond secure by design and secure by default and really address the problems and threats that you see, not just today, but tomorrow and in 5 years?
Thank you.
I could start with that.
Yeah.
So I talked a lot about our kind of tactical day-to-day sharing that we're doing on the threat of today, but we do have other efforts that are focused on really the threat of tomorrow. And so I would say the one thing I would highlight is the Enduring Security Framework, which is both an NSA and CISA-led initiative with industry that is really focused on those longer-term, longer horizon problems that we need to collectively do together. So it's really looking at what is the threat driving, and then how do we need to respond as a whole of nation? And so we're looking at things like 5G, securing, getting industry more involved in standards organizations to make sure that Western, more secure standards are included in international standards bodies. That is an area where PRC has had great success in influencing standards for their own technology benefits. So coming together collectively, we just hosted a cybersecurity standards summit at the Collaboration Center last month to bring in our industry folks so that we could talk about that collectively. So I'd say participating in those efforts that are really focused on the longer term. We've done a lot of studies on identity and access management based off what we knew nation state actors were doing and how they were able to bypass MFA and look at different ways that they could look at misconfigurations to get around it. And so that is really the body that we're looking at to really take on those harder problems, those longer term problems that we would love additional partnership in.
And I think I would also add to, I mentioned at the outset that one of the wins that we had was in the space of bidirectional information sharing, where a partner came to us, a financial sector firm came to us with the information that they had seen. We need to see more of that. I think there is an assumption that the IC knows everything, that we see everything, and that is not true. And I think there is also very valid criticism of the IC for years that we weren't sharing enough with the private sector as proactively as we could have. And I think we've made a lot of strides. Mm-hmm. Kristina has given some very good examples. We're doing a lot of work to write for release, to increase how we are sharing downgraded information with the public sector, or with the private sector. But I think we also need to develop a partnership and trust where the private sector at large feels comfortable sharing the information that they are seeing that's concerning on their networks with us, knowing that we will safeguard that information, knowing that we are not the regulators. And so there are certain obligations to share information and reports don't necessarily hold with the intelligence community. And so I think that is something that we would love to see more of.
I'd like to elaborate on something that Kristina raised earlier, which is, as you look at the cyber threat landscape, as you look, for example, at the Volt Typhoon actors that are moving from foreign internet space to domestic internet space to directly touch critical infrastructure owners and operators here in the United States, I think partnership and collaboration is important, and one of the challenges is how to think about doing it at the speed and scale of the threat. The IC has one optic, which is the overseas aspect of the threat. Law enforcement kind of spans a little bit about the overseas and the domestic. The cyber defense community, particularly our CISA colleagues, but also the sector risk management agencies, also understand an aspect of the threat that takes that even a little further through their engagement with the critical infrastructure owners and operators. And then there's the private sector, the cybersecurity firms that have vast telemetry data that covers vast swaths of geography and industry segments, and the owners and operators that are watching their own networks. Each of those is a piece of the puzzle, and the challenge is how to bring those together and partner at speed and scale of the threat to dynamically follow these actors. And I think we do that well in the interagency, but I think there's going to be an increasing premium to think about that at speed and scale. And I think one of the challenges we're going to have to think about is how do we introduce automation in that process to better foster more shared cyber domain awareness to enable that collective action against the threat. And so I think there's some automation that's needed in there, and also thinking about doing it with industry standards so that as we're thinking about it in the IC and the government, we can also think about the right information exchange with the industry.
Do you think there's anyone in the room who might be able to help us with automation?
I think there are multiple smart thinkers in this area that probably have ideas on how to think about that. I'll add one other dynamic to this, which is how do you pivot from cyber artifacts, something like an IP address or something called a hash, which is a signature of a tool, into non-cyber artifacts that help to enable us to think about attribution and enable us to think about countering. And particularly as you're looking at this activity, that attribution question is pretty important to thinking about some of the policy options that we have there, particularly looking at foreign government direction or control of some of the activity.
Great. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, I'm Scott Cooper from Peraton, and he might have stolen a little bit of my thunder, but my question is for Kristina and Shannon specifically. What are the things that are making your head hurt that we in industry can be helpful to you with? Because I think a lot of times we're responsive when you're like, hey, I do need help with this, but that takes a long time for you to get out. If there's any advice you had of how we should spend our IRAD or things that are making your head hurt that we could be helpful with.
Yeah, I could start. So I think one thing that we have found, especially over the last 4 years, is that if we don't have established baseline and trust with partners, when it comes to really needing each other, it's hard to start from scratch. So we have found that you can't surge that trust quickly. And so I think these programs were set up, when we started, we had 2 partners. We have over 1,200 now. But we're really looking at the thing that makes my head hurt is the scale with which we need to protect, critical infrastructure. I obviously focus mostly on the defense industrial base. That's still hundreds of thousands of companies. And so we are taking it from a multifaceted approach of working with those large providers who can build in security, who can action information on behalf of their customers and protect them. There's different risk calculuses that each company has on what information they're willing to action. And so we find that some of our ISP partners will, sinkhole traffic globally if we give them infrastructure that we know is malicious. Others have more risk aversion to doing things like that to protecting their customers. So I think that collaboration to really protect at scale and partnering early on so that when we're sharing information, we know each other, we have an established mechanism to do that, we understand the authorities with which we're sharing it under and how it's going to be protected so that when we need it in a crisis, we're there.
I completely agree. I don't know that I can say too much more beyond that, except that when we are sharing information with the financial sector, we're not just simply sharing information that we see that is specifically of concern to the financial sector's networks itself or what we're seeing on the financial sector, reporting on the financial sector. We're sharing with them information that we're seeing about concerning activity across a wide range of critical infrastructure because that awareness for them is absolutely necessary. And so I think, broadly speaking, I would like to see more of that come back into the government as well, to an understanding that what might be seen in terms of concerning activity on water or transportation infrastructure, communication infrastructure, is going to be of interest to every critical infrastructure sector.
I'd like to add one other dimension to the building of trust and information sharing, which I think we're exercising that muscle now. We're successfully with these models building trust. I think one other aspect of the public-private conversation that we need to think about is how would we react in a crisis? Think about if the Taiwan crisis emerges like we saw yesterday in the tabletop scenario that Admiral Montgomery walked us through. I think that one of the challenges we have is the public sector will have one set of calculations and imperatives, And we may not fully understand some of the calculations and constraints that the private sector may operate under. And I think we had great partnerships and conversations at the outset of Russia-Ukraine. I think that in a Taiwan scenario, the calculations will probably be more complex, and it's probably good to have those conversations before we come to a crisis.
If I could just pull the thread on that a little bit on the ask. I think what we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine is industry really having to make a lot of hard choices about where they did business, how they did business, how their network was segmented. I think having those conversations now for the potential Taiwan situation is also an area where we partner together. Think about the resiliency plan. Think about where your connections are. Think about if you have to cut off a connection to part of your global operations, what that would look like and how we would work together. And sharing that information with us is super helpful. I joke a lot. I briefed at Black Hat with Viasat. Like if Viasat had let us know that they provided SATCOM communications over Ukraine before it was knocked out at 04100, that would have been really helpful. And so I think having those conversations with your partners so that we can kind of exercise these things together before they happen would be useful.
I think we have just run out of time, almost exactly on cue. So Suzanne, are we good? Is it?
One more.
Okay, great.
Oh, thank you. So we did some research in support of Office of Economic Security and Emerging Technology.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things, and I don't know if this is out of bounds, is undersea cables. And I guess we were shocked at the amount of data. I think it was north of 90% of intercontinental data going through undersea cables. So I don't know if this is something you guys can comment on, the threat or what's being done to help make undersea cables more resilient.
I think that's a complex challenge that we're going to have to think about, because particularly if you think about a Taiwan crisis, you're dealing with an island nation. And so if you think about that, how do you think about what does resilience look like? And so to some of the point of the earlier discussion of how would the private sector react, if, say, a cable were cut in that type of a situation of heightened tensions, could we as the government, how would we partner with the private sector to think about replacing that? Or how would we think about what all other alternatives exist to provide that communication? So it is a complex challenge, and I think one of the challenges we have to think about is that these cables run through areas that are controlled or geographic areas that could be potentially dominated by the PRC in a crisis situation.
There was a great piece that the New York Times ran maybe 4 years ago or so, and it was a fantastic visual. It said something to the effect of, you may think your data is in the cloud, but it's really undersea. And it was just such a compelling way of making a pretty complex topic very very understandable for, I think, the average reader. And I think it's something that we just take for granted. I think when you look at the increasing satellite capabilities on a commercial level, there's an assumption that there's all this communication that's happening across satellites, and I know enough to be dangerous, and that's about it. But I do know that there's not enough capacity in the nature of the way satellites can augment that communication, to make up for the 90 to 95% of communication that travels and data that travels in undersea cables.
Could I add one quick point, which is just as you think about the resilience question, whether it's Taiwan or other allies and partners, you may have relationships with those partners, and you may find that there are various pain points in the legal and policy frameworks in those countries where, if only they were resolved, it would make it a lot easier to help bolster resilience. Those would be useful to know as we think about, from an ODNI or other standpoints, in engaging with those partners to think about what are some of the policy and legal frameworks that they need in advance of a crisis. And that was important in the Ukraine scenario, where Ukraine was able to, at the last minute, make some legislative changes that enabled them to move their data to the cloud. And so how do we think about doing those well prior to a crisis?
Well, thank you, Kristina, Shannon, Dana. Thank you for taking the time. I should note also for Admiral Montgomery, who wanted Energy to be involved, to let you guys know that the Department of Energy's intelligence organization, J, wanted to be here but couldn't because of a previous commitment. But we did want to incorporate energy into the critical infrastructure discussion as well. So thank you very much. Over to Suzanne.